Hello everyone. Before we dive into today's video, I want to take a moment to thank you all for the incredible support you've shown me. As I mentioned in my previous video, I've been dealing with an invalid traffic issue, and your continued support means a lot to me. If you enjoy today's content, please consider leaving a comment below. It really helps with my issue right now. And if you'd like to take it a step further, you can join the CreepyCorner community by becoming a member and helping me prove YouTube wrong even more. Thanks again, and enjoy the stories. I found a Christmas gift hidden in my house with a tag that says, "From the dark web." Alright, I never thought I'd end up writing on here, but I'm officially creeped out, and I feel like I need to get this out. A bit of background. I've always been super careful online. I'm one of those people who doesn't click on sketchy links, avoid suspicious websites, and never, ever even thought about touching the deep web. I've heard all the stories and seen enough videos to know that stuff's not for me. I just live a pretty regular life, you know? Work my 9 to 5, hang out with friends on the weekends, nothing crazy. Now, this story starts about a week before Christmas. I live alone in this small 2-bedroom house just outside of town. It's quiet, a bit old-fashioned, but cozy. I've been here about 3 years, and nothing strange has ever happened until now. So, last Friday, I was pulling out the Christmas decorations from the attic. My parents were supposed to come over for Christmas, so I wanted the place to feel festive. I was rummaging through the usual stuff, ornaments, lights, that weird tinsel that sheds everywhere, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just part of my old Christmas stash, but then I noticed it was wrapped, like gift wrapped. Now, here's the weird part. I had no memory of ever wrapping this thing. I didn't even recognize the paper. It was this strange, faded, almost antique-looking paper, kind of brownish with these red and green stripes that looked like they'd seen better days. But I figured, hey, maybe I just forgot about it. Maybe it was an old gift that got lost up here somehow, right? But then I saw the tag. It was written in this thin, spidery handwriting that almost looked like it was scratched into the paper, like someone had taken a needle or something to write it. And all it said was, "From the dark web." My brain kind of froze. From the dark web? Like, seriously? It had to be a joke, right? I thought maybe one of my friends was pranking me. I do have a buddy, James, who's into hacking and all that techie stuff. So my first thought was he snuck it in here somehow to mess with me. I actually called him right then and there, laughing, expecting him to crack up and say, "Yeah, I got you." But he didn't. Instead, he sounded genuinely confused. He kept saying he had no idea what I was talking about. And James isn't exactly an Oscar-winning actor. I can tell when he's messing with me. This time, he sounded dead serious. So I hung up, and for a while, I just stared at the thing. I can't explain it, but something felt off. Like I could feel this weird heaviness around it, you know? Like the air got thicker, but I told myself I was being dramatic. It was just a wrapped present, nothing more. Still, the tag nagged at me. Why would anyone leave something like this in my attic? I ended up just leaving it there, convincing myself it was a weird prank and nothing more. But that night, things started getting weird. I was lying in bed around midnight, scrolling through my phone, just about to doze off, when I heard this faint scraping sound. It wasn't super loud, but it was just enough to wake me up. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but then it happened again, and again. It was this slow, rhythmic scratching, almost like someone was dragging something sharp against wood. The sound seemed to be coming from above me, the attic. At that point, I was wide awake. I sat up, listening. The scratching stopped for a second, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then it started again, even louder, like whatever was up there knew I was listening. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was probably an animal or something. Maybe a raccoon or a squirrel had somehow gotten in through the roof. I kept telling myself that as I walked down the hall to the attic door. I grabbed a flashlight, opened the door, and slowly climbed up. The attic was pitch black and freezing. My breath came out in puffs as I shined the flashlight around, trying to find the source of the noise. There was nothing. No animals, no weird shadows. Nothing. Just the boxes of decorations and that creepy gift sitting in the corner. I shone the flashlight on it, and I swear it looked different. Like the paper had darkened, and the handwriting on the tag looked messier, more frantic. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was my imagination. I headed back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I eventually fell asleep, but that night, I had the most vivid dream. I was back in the attic, standing in front of that gift, and it was pulsing, like it had a heartbeat, almost. And the tag didn't say, "From the dark web," anymore. It said, "Open me." The next morning, I woke up in a cold sweat, and the first thing I did was check the attic to make sure it was still there. And yeah, it was, sitting there, looking just as disturbing as the night before. But now, there was something else. This time, there was a faint smell hanging in the air, like burnt wood or maybe burnt plastic. And here's the part that freaked me out the most. The tag was gone. Just gone. The gift was still there, looking as unsettling as ever. But that weird little tag had completely vanished. I searched everywhere, tearing through the boxes, thinking maybe it had fallen off, but it was nowhere to be found. At that point, I was so freaked out, I actually considered just taking the gift outside and tossing it in the trash. But a part of me hesitated. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more than just a prank. The next day, I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I went about my usual routine, ate breakfast, answered emails, and tried to act like I wasn't just haunted by some bizarre gift in my attic. I hadn't even looked at the thing again since that morning, but it was always in the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Then, weird stuff started happening around the house. The first thing I noticed was that the air felt heavier. It's hard to explain, but you know when a storm's about to hit and everything feels dense, like the air itself is pressing down on you. That's what it felt like. Just this thick, still air hanging around, especially near the attic door. But the sky was clear, and the weather app showed no storms. It wasn't just the air either. I started noticing things going missing. Little stuff at first. My keys weren't where I left them. The remote was under the couch instead of on the coffee table. I chalked it up to me being scatterbrained from all the holiday prep. But then, my wallet disappeared. I tore the place apart looking for it. I checked every drawer, every pocket, even under the bed, but it was nowhere. I had literally just used it that morning. I was about to give up when, on a hunch, I checked the attic. I opened the door, half expecting something to jump out at me. The smell was worse up there now, like something smoldering, not strong, but faint, lingering. And there it was, my wallet, just lying there on the floor next to that wrapped gift. I didn't even remember going up there, let alone bringing my wallet with me. I snatched it up, practically sprinted back down, and slammed the attic door shut. I was officially creeped out. By that evening, I was seriously considering taking the gift out to the trash, or even calling a friend to come stay over for the night. But a part of me still wanted to believe it was just a prank. That night, I triple-checked every lock and closed every curtain, trying to shake off that feeling of being watched. And that's when I noticed something new. There was a small, muddy footprint on the tile floor near the attic door. It was tiny, like kid-sized, and just one, smudged but unmistakably a footprint. Now, I don't have kids. There's no reason that print should have been there, especially since I'd mopped the day before. I checked every window, every door again, thinking maybe someone had broken in, but everything was locked up tight. At that point, I was almost too scared to sleep, but I had work the next morning, and there was only so much I could take before exhaustion won. I left every light on in the house and kept a baseball bat by my bed, just in case. I drifted off, but that night, the dream came back. This time, it was clearer. I was standing in the attic again, facing that gift. Only now, it was whispering. I couldn't make out what it was saying. It was just this soft, scratchy voice, repeating the same word over and over. I strained to hear, but the sound was like static, like someone was trying to speak through an old, broken radio. When I woke up, my heart was pounding, and my sheets were damp with sweat. I grabbed my phone just to get my mind on something else, and that's when I noticed it. There was a text, but it wasn't from any of my contacts. The number was just a string of zeros. And the message? It was just 2 words. Open it. I nearly dropped my phone. Now I was sure someone was messing with me. I called James again, telling him everything, but he swore up and down it wasn't him. I could hear the worry in his voice, like he was genuinely freaked out by how shaken I sounded. He even offered to come over, but I told him I was fine. Maybe I just didn't want to admit that I wasn't. For the rest of the day, I avoided the attic. Every time I passed by the door, I'd get this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like something was waiting on the other side, watching. But I kept telling myself it was all in my head. I went about my day, ran a few errands, grabbed coffee with a friend. I tried to keep things normal. But when I got home that night, my heart sank. Every single light in my house was off. Now, I always leave at least one light on when I go out, especially with it getting dark so early in the winter. But tonight, it was pitch black. I stepped inside, fumbling for the light switch, but nothing happened. I checked the breaker. Everything was fine. Then I remembered my flashlight. I'd left it in the attic the other night when I was looking around. Perfect. With no other choice, I took a deep breath, opened the attic door, and climbed up, using my phone flashlight to guide the way. The air was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the burnt smell was stronger than ever, practically stinging my nose. And then, there it was again, the gift, sitting exactly where I'd left it, but somehow it looked different. The paper seemed more crumpled, like something inside had been moving around. And the tag was back, only now it said, "Open or else." I stared at it, heart racing. Something about it felt alive, like it was daring me to touch it, to rip off the paper and finally see what was inside. I don't know what came over me, but I slowly reached out, fingers trembling, and started to peel back the paper. The wrapping came off easily, almost like it was old, tearing in long strips that revealed a small, plain wooden box underneath. The wood was dark, worn, with strange little symbols carved into it. They looked like letters, but they weren't in any language I recognized, jagged and sharp, almost like they'd been scratched on in a hurry. I ran my fingers over the lid, feeling every groove, every scratch. It was cold to the touch, and something inside me screamed to stop, to leave it alone. But I was so close, and I'd come this far. I had to know. Just as I was about to lift the lid, I heard it. That scratching sound again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the attic. It was coming from inside the box. I froze, my hand hovering over the box. That scratching sound, it wasn't just in my head. It was coming from inside, like something was alive in there, clawing to get out. The rational part of my brain told me this was insane, that I should drop the box, throw it out, do anything but open it. But I couldn't move. It felt like the box was pulling me in, daring me to lift the lid. The scratching was slow, steady, a relentless tap, tap, tap that seemed to match the beat of my own heart. And then, without realizing it, I felt my hand start to move again. My fingers curled around the edge of the lid, and before I knew it, I was lifting it. The lid creaked open, and for a second, there was nothing but darkness inside, just empty, black space. But as I leaned in, trying to make sense of it, something shifted, something moved in the dark, and that's when I saw it, just the faintest glint of an eye. My body jerked back, and I nearly dropped the box. Whatever was inside, it wasn't human. The eye looked almost like glass, but it blinked, slowly, deliberately, like it was studying me, waiting for me to do something. I stumbled back, slamming the lid shut, heart pounding like it was going to burst out of my chest. As soon as the lid closed, the scratching stopped. The silence was so thick, it hurt my ears, like the sound had been vacuumed out of the room. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that box, trying to convince myself that what I saw wasn't real. But then I noticed something else, something I couldn't deny. There was a name scratched into the wood on the underside of the lid, as if whoever made the box had carved it there with a knife. I leaned closer to make it out, and that's when I felt my stomach twist. The name carved into the wood was mine. At that point, I'd had enough. I grabbed the box, stormed down the attic steps, and ran outside into the freezing December night. I didn't care if I looked insane to my neighbors. I wasn't spending another second with that thing in my house. I walked to the far edge of my backyard, past the trees, and tossed it into the snow, watching as it sank into the ground. I stayed out there until my fingers went numb, making sure it wasn't moving, that whatever was inside wouldn't claw its way out and follow me back into the house. When I finally went back inside, I locked the doors and windows, practically barricading myself in my bedroom. For the first time in my life, I genuinely felt unsafe in my own home. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but things only got worse. The next day, I woke up to my phone buzzing with notifications. My friends had been texting me all night, asking if I was okay, if I needed help. Confused, I opened the messages, only to feel my stomach drop. Each text was a screenshot of me posting on social media around midnight. The messages were strange, jumbled, like they were typed by someone who didn't quite know what they were doing. But here's the thing, I hadn't posted any of it. The first post was just a photo of my house, taken from the edge of my yard in the exact spot where I'd thrown the box. The caption said, "Home, Sweet home. Opened the door. The second post was even worse. It was a photo of my attic door, slightly ajar, with the caption, "Almost there." My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the posts, each one more disturbing than the last. They were all photos taken inside my house, my kitchen, my living room, my bedroom, and every photo was captioned with one message: "Come find me." I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside made me jump, convinced that whatever was inside that box had somehow found a way back in. I must have checked the locks a dozen times, but no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I remembered the cameras. A few months ago, after a break-in scare down the street, I'd set up a few security cameras around the house, one by the front door, one in the living room, and one outside by the back fence. I'd never needed to check them before, but now I was desperate for answers. I pulled up the footage on my phone, scrolling through the timestamps until I found the one I was looking for. The moment I tossed the box in the snow, the screen showed me standing in my yard, shivering, holding the box. I watched myself throw it, watched as it hit the ground and sank into the snow, just as I remembered. But then, a few seconds later, something happened that made my blood run cold. The box moved. At first, it was just a slight twitch, like something was shifting inside, but then it started sliding across the snow, almost like it was being dragged. There was no one there, no hand pulling it, no footprints, just that box, inching its way closer to my house. I felt like I was going to be sick. I watched as it moved, slowly but surely, until it was out of the camera's frame. I checked the other cameras, my heart pounding, but there was nothing, no sign of the box, no shadowy figures, just my empty, silent house. I shut off the feed and stared at my phone, mind racing. Was it possible? Could something inside that box really be alive? And if so, what did it want? The next day, I tried calling James again, desperate to tell someone, anyone. But when he picked up, his voice was different, slow, almost dazed, like he was in a trance. I told him everything, from the gift to the box, to the strange posts, but he didn't respond. Just silence on the other end. And then, in this low, almost monotone voice, he said, "You shouldn't have opened it." I froze. "James, what are you talking about?" He repeated himself, his voice flat, mechanical. "You shouldn't have opened it. It knows now." "James, what do you mean?" "What knows?" There was a long pause, and then I heard something in the background, a faint scratching sound, just like the one in my attic, and before I could say anything else, he hung up. I tried calling him back, but it went straight to voicemail. I left him a message, begging him to call me back, but deep down, I knew I wouldn't hear from him again. The hours after that call with James were some of the longest of my life. I'd lost all sense of time, just sitting there with my phone in my hand, replaying his words in my head. "It knows now." Those words echoed, making my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was creeping closer, inching its way toward me, waiting for me to slip. I had checked every room, every corner of my house, trying to convince myself that the box wasn't somehow lurking in a shadow or tucked into a corner, watching me. My entire world had shrunk to the walls of my house, and the worst part was, I was too afraid to leave. Then came the tapping. It started around 3 a.m, a faint, rhythmic sound, like fingernails drumming on wood. The sound was so quiet at first that I thought I was imagining it, but as it grew louder, I realized it was coming from the front door. Tap, tap, tap. I crept down the hall, each step taking me closer to the sound, my heart thudding in my chest. When I reached the door, I held my breath, peeking through the peephole, and that's when my blood turned to ice. There was nothing there, just the empty porch, dark and silent. I waited, staring through that peephole, convinced that any second something would reveal itself. But the porch stayed empty, no movement, no shadow, nothing. Then the tapping started again, this time from inside the house. It was coming from the living room, soft but insistent, as if something wanted me to follow. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat tighten, but I couldn't ignore it. I slowly made my way to the living room, gripping my phone like it was a lifeline. The tapping grew louder, guiding me toward the fireplace, and there it was, the box. It was sitting on the mantel, right there in plain sight, like it had always been there. The wrapping was gone, revealing the dark, scratched wood, and the lid was ever so slightly ajar. I could barely breathe as I inched closer, my hand shaking as I reached out, ready to push it off the mantel, throw it across the room, anything to get it away from me. But before I could, my phone vibrated in my hand, startling me so badly that I nearly dropped it. I glanced down to see a text from James's number, though I hadn't heard from him since that strange call. My heart raced as I opened the message. It was a photo of me, standing in my living room, staring at the box. The angle was from right behind me, like someone had taken it just seconds ago. My skin prickled as I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty, just me and the box. Then the phone buzzed again. Another message. This time it was a video. Hands shaking, I hit play, and the screen showed a familiar scene. My bedroom. The camera was shaky, the footage grainy and dark, but I could just make out the shape of my bed, my clothes on the floor, the half-open closet door. It was like someone was filming the room, slowly panning across, as if they were searching for something, and then the camera stopped. It was pointed directly at the closet. In the video, I watched as the closet door creaked open, inch by inch. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that whatever was filming was inside my house. It was in my bedroom. Just then, I heard something upstairs. A faint creak, like footsteps on the floorboards above me. My mind went blank with terror. I'd left all the lights on downstairs, but the hallway leading up to my bedroom was pitch black. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, each step bringing them closer to the stairs. I held my breath, backing away from the box and retreating into the kitchen. My mind raced, scrambling for a plan. I could run, call for help, but deep down, I had a feeling that whatever was up there wouldn't stop. It was like the box was a beacon, a calling card that had brought something into my home, something that didn't care about locked doors or walls. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs, and a shadow stretched down the wall, long and thin, almost distorted, like it didn't belong to anything human. I backed into the corner, hiding behind the kitchen counter, my eyes locked on the stairwell, but nothing came down. The shadow stayed still, just hanging there in the darkness, taunting me. And then the scratching started again, but this time it wasn't from the box. It was coming from inside the walls. I pressed my ear against the wall, barely able to breathe. The scratching was moving, shifting from one part of the wall to another, like something was crawling through the space between the drywall and the plaster, dragging itself closer and closer. I could feel it getting closer, the sound deep and guttural, almost like a growl, echoing from within the walls of my own home. And then the sound stopped, replaced by a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but the words were unmistakable. "Open it!" I clutched my head, trying to drown out the voice, but it was relentless, repeating over and over again, filling the silence with its eerie, raspy chant. "Open it! Open it! Open it!" I didn't know how long I stayed there, huddled in the dark, listening to that whisper crawl through my mind. But eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. My hands moved on their own, reaching for the box, and before I knew it, I was lifting the lid once again. The darkness inside seemed to expand, filling the room with an unnatural chill. I held my breath, peering into the box, half expecting that glassy eye to reappear. But this time, it was different. Instead of an eye, I saw a slip of paper at the bottom, folded and yellowed, like it had been there for decades. With trembling fingers, I pulled out the paper, unfolding it slowly. Scrawled in the same spidery handwriting as before was a message, one that made my skin crawl with dread. "You let me in." The second I read those words, the air grew thick, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around me. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, trapped in some unseen grip. And then, from somewhere behind me, I felt a cold, bony hand rest on my shoulder, squeezing just hard enough to send a shock of pain down my arm. A voice, low and distorted, whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have opened it." I couldn't move, couldn't scream, as the pressure on my shoulder tightened, forcing me to face the box once more. The lid had closed, but now it looked different, more worn, the carvings deeper, like they were shifting before my eyes. The last thing I remember was that voice, whispering in my ear as the world around me went dark. "Now, it's your turn to stay inside." And with that, everything faded to black. When I came to, I was lying on my living room floor. The lights were off, and everything felt cold, unnaturally cold, like I'd been left out in the snow. My body ached, and for a moment, I couldn't move, like I was still trapped in that horrible, frozen grip. I blinked, trying to adjust to the darkness, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The box was gone. I scrambled up, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any trace of it, but it was nowhere to be seen. It was as if it had never been there in the first place. The mantel was empty, not a single scratch or mark left behind. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess, to convince myself it had been some terrible dream. But the silence in the room felt too real, too heavy. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound was so loud in the quiet that I nearly jumped out of my skin. My hand shook as I pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text, and my heart skipped when I saw the number, James's number. I opened the message, hoping for some explanation, some answer, but all it said was, "Where are you?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure how to respond. I wanted to scream that I didn't know, that I didn't even understand what had just happened. But before I could type anything, another message appeared. "We're waiting." I stared at the screen, dread creeping into my chest. We? Who was we? My mind raced through 1,000 horrible possibilities, but none of them made sense. I needed to talk to James, to hear his voice, to make sure he was okay. I dialed his number, pressing the phone to my ear, the dial tone echoing in the silence. After what felt like an eternity, he picked up. But it wasn't James's voice. The voice on the other end was low, raspy, almost inhuman. each word dragging like nails on glass. You shouldn't have opened it. My blood ran cold. Where is James? I demanded, my voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause, followed by a soft chuckle. James is here. With us. We're all here, waiting for you. I wanted to scream, to throw my phone across the room, but I was frozen, rooted in place by that voice. It felt like it was pulling me in, drawing me closer with every word, whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. I could feel something closing in, a darkness pressing against me, suffocating. And then, the line went dead. My hands were shaking so hard, I almost dropped the phone. I stumbled into the hallway, mind racing, trying to think of any way out of this nightmare. But as I reached for the front door, I realized something was wrong. The doorknob felt strange. It was cold, not the usual chill of winter, but a deep, biting cold that seemed to sink into my bones. I twisted it, but the door wouldn't budge. I tried again, pulling harder, but it was like the door was welded shut. Panic surged through me as I ran to the windows, yanking at them, pounding on the glass, but they wouldn't open either. Every exit was sealed, locked tight, as if the house itself was holding me in. And then, as I backed away, my foot hit something. I looked down to see a box. The same box, sitting in the middle of the hallway, waiting for me. The lid was open, and inside was that slip of paper with the same words as before. You let me in. I took a shaky step back, only to feel that cold, bony hand on my shoulder again, gripping tight, locking me in place. My breath hitched as I turned my head, expecting to see something, but there was no one there, just that awful cold pressure, pressing down harder, forcing me to look into the box once more. And this time, I saw something else in the darkness inside the box. A face. My face, staring back at me, twisted in terror, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, away from the box, but it was no use. Every wall, every surface in the house was shifting, stretching, bending toward me. The shadows in the room grew darker, swirling around me, filling the air with that same low whisper, repeating over and over, "You let me in." And that's when I realized what it meant. The box was never meant to be opened. It was a trap, a doorway, one that I had opened willingly, one that couldn't be shut. I had let something in, something that had been waiting, watching, looking for someone to set it free. And now that it was here, it was going to stay. The darkness thickened, and I felt myself slipping, fading, like I was being pulled underwater. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my own face in the box, staring back at me, frozen in terror, trapped forever. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the corner of my living room, staring at my own body lying on the floor, pale and still. My phone was on the ground beside me, buzzing with another text, but I couldn't move, couldn't pick it up. I was stuck, locked in place, watching as shadows crept along the walls, circling closer, tighter, until there was nothing left but darkness. I don't know how long I've been here. I don't know if anyone will ever find me. All I know is that the box is gone. The house is silent. But sometimes, in the quiet, I can still hear that whisper, echoing through the darkness. You let me in. I accepted a job to protect a VIP on the dark web. The VIP isn't human. So, let me start by saying, yeah, I know, I shouldn't have been on the dark web. I'm well aware of how stupid it sounds. But if you're curious, right? Sometimes I think it's like one of those horror movies where the main character sees a locked door and they just have to open it. That was me, I guess. This all started a couple of months back when I was going through a rough patch. I'd been laid off, my rent was due, and I was desperate. The job market sucked, and even though I'm a decent programmer, I couldn't land anything that would cover my bills. So, I started doing some freelance stuff. Basic coding gigs, nothing crazy. Just little projects that people post on sketchy forums and freelance sites. Most were totally legit, albeit low paying. Then one night, I stumbled across an anonymous post in a hidden forum. It didn't have a title, just a single line of text. Looking for someone with strong nerve and a flexible schedule. Payment, $5,000 a day. No questions asked. $5,000 a day. Right away, it felt off, but I couldn't help it. My curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked. The job listing was vague as hell, but they laid out a few requirements. It just said they needed someone who was willing to protect a VIP, and they didn't mean physically. They made it sound like a digital security job with a touch of surveillance work. Not really sure what that was supposed to mean, but I figured I'd just be setting up firewalls or monitoring internet traffic. Easy stuff, especially for that kind of money. So against all my better judgment, I sent in my information. Minutes later, I got a reply with a link to a private, encrypted chat room and instructions to join within 15 minutes. Weirdly specific, but I didn't want to lose the gig, so I went in. In the chat, there was a guy with the username Eidolon, which felt appropriately creepy, I guess. He asked me a few questions about my background. Normal stuff, like my experience with network security and VPNs, and if I'd ever done any digital monitoring before. I lied a bit, trying to make myself sound more experienced than I was, and Eidolon seemed to buy it. After a couple of minutes, he finally sent a confirmation. You're hired. He then laid out the rules. No telling anyone about this job, obviously. No saving any information about it on my personal devices. And the weirdest rule of all, under no circumstances are you to contact or communicate with the VIP. That should have been a red flag, right? But I just assumed they meant it was some high-profile client, maybe a CEO with enemies, and my job was to keep them safe without bothering them. Eidolon sent me a file labeled VIP_profile_01.jpg and a second file called instructions.docx. I downloaded them onto a burner laptop I'd set up specifically for these dark web gigs, separate from my own stuff, and I'd always delete everything right after the job was done. I was being careful, or at least I thought I was. I opened the profile picture first. Now, listen, I've seen a lot of weird stuff on the internet. I'm no stranger to strange, alright? But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. The photo was wrong. That's the best way I can put it. It was a high-definition image of someone or something that looked almost human, like close enough that you'd pass it on the street and not think twice. But when you stared, you'd notice all the things that were just slightly off. The skin was smooth, too smooth, like it was stretched too tightly over a thin frame. The eyes were huge, unnaturally huge, black and glossy, almost like they were polished stones. And the smile, God, I'll never forget it, stretched a little too far, like it was trying to look friendly, but ended up feeling forced, like an amateur trying to mimic a smile without really understanding how. I pushed away from my laptop, breathing hard. It was just a picture, but for some reason, it had me rattled. My rational brain was screaming at me to bail on this job, to shut my laptop and move on, but $5,000 a day. I couldn't ignore that. Maybe it was a joke, some kind of marketing prank, like those fake AI human projects they show off to tech companies. That's what I told myself, and with a shaky breath, I opened the document. The instructions.docx was worse. It detailed my job, which I was half right about. It did involve monitoring, but not in the way I expected. The document listed a series of odd surveillance tasks. I'd have to check specific sites at specific times, then record any unusual occurrences and report them back to Eidolon at the end of each day. These sites were obscure, some on the deep web and others that just looked like forgotten corners of the internet. Forums with no posts, just strange symbols, old image boards that were half corrupted with broken links, even a live feed from a parking lot somewhere. My job was to watch these places. I'd never heard of anyone wanting to monitor such a bizarre collection of spots. It was like being asked to check random street corners in the middle of nowhere every day, just to make sure they're still there. The only thing that tied it all together was that I had to check every single one at exactly 3:33 a.m. Not a second before, not a second after. There was a final line at the bottom of the document that said, "Do not interact with any entities you may see. Do not acknowledge the VIP under any circumstances." I told myself, it's just a prank, some bored rich dude with too much money, or maybe some social experiment. I wanted to believe that, and $5,000 a day was way too good to pass up. But in my gut, I knew this was different. I didn't want to admit it, but something about this felt alive. And somehow, I had this horrible, nagging feeling that whatever this VIP was, it knew I was coming. I spent the rest of that night debating if I should just ghost Eidolon and pretend I'd never seen that picture or read those instructions. But every time I thought about backing out, I kept picturing that fat payday. I was broke and desperate, and that money could fix everything. So, against my better judgment, I decided to go through with it. The first night was weird. That's probably the only word that really captures it. I set my alarm for 3:15 a.m. and stayed up in my dimly lit apartment, sipping on way too much coffee. As the minutes ticked closer, my anxiety crept up. The stillness around me felt heavy, and every little creak of the building settling made me jump. Finally, my alarm went off, and I grabbed the burner laptop, booting it up with shaky hands. I had a list of URLs to go through, each with specific instructions. Some were set up as live streams, some were forums, and a couple were literally just static images that I had to open and observe. My brain was still reeling from how pointless it seemed, until I actually started looking. The first site was a live feed of a parking lot in the middle of nowhere. It was grainy and dark, like some abandoned security cam feed. I watched for 5 minutes straight, nothing happening, and I was about to move on when I noticed something. A single figure, barely a silhouette, standing just at the edge of the camera's view. I thought it was just a glitch, maybe an old recording playing on a loop or something. But as I stared at the screen, I realized that whatever it was facing directly toward the camera. I shifted uncomfortably, trying to shake the feeling that it was looking at me. Like somehow, through the monitor, it was aware I was watching. It didn't move an inch, so I forced myself to look away and checked the next site. This one was some kind of dead forum, empty threads with random symbols as usernames. No posts, just empty profiles with strings of characters that didn't make sense. I clicked through a few, noting their profiles like Eidolon's instructions said. Then I reached one profile with a picture, but instead of a face, it showed this symbol. It was like a circle with lines etched around it, almost like an eye. And the closer I looked, the more I felt this weird dizziness, like my head was filled with static. I quickly closed the tab. My skin was crawling, but I kept going down the list. The next site was just a still image, something that looked like an abandoned hospital corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead were barely working, and there was a shadow on the far end of the hallway, stretched long and thin, like something tall was just around the corner. As I stared, the light started to flicker. I told myself it was just an image, a badly taken photo with poor lighting. But then the lights on my ceiling flickered too, just for a split second. My laptop screen dimmed, and a notification pinged on my burner. It was from Eidolon. Continue to the next task. That message hit me like a gut punch. This guy was watching me, and the thought of him knowing exactly where I was and what I was doing. Let's just say it didn't sit well. But I was already in this deep. I wasn't about to back out now, not when I'd already seen so much. The next stop on my list was another live feed. This one pointed at a rusted metal door with a single red light over it. The door looked like it hadn't been touched in years, just left to rot. As I watched, though, the light above it started to flicker, dimming out until the screen went completely black. Then, after a few seconds, the camera flickered back on and the door was open. I couldn't see what was inside, just an inky darkness that seemed to absorb all the light around it. Then, as I watched, the door slowly creaked shut again, like it was on ancient, barely functioning hinges. The chat pinged again. Do not look away. My pulse was racing now. I couldn't stop thinking about that warning in the instructions. Do not acknowledge any entities you see. Was that what I'd just seen? An entity? Some part of me felt like the longer I looked, the more I'd see things I couldn't unsee. The final task was back on that image of the hospital corridor. When I clicked back over, I saw the shadow at the end of the hallway had moved. It was closer to the camera now, and I could make out, I don't know how else to describe it, but it looked like a blur, a mess of stretched out features that didn't belong on a human face, like a kid's drawing of a person that had been left out in the rain, the lines smudged and dripping, forming something almost human, but deeply, deeply wrong. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure kept coming closer, slow but relentless, like it knew I was stuck there watching. I didn't dare close the window, not after Eidolon's message. I just waited, my heart pounding out of my chest, as the figure crept forward until its face filled the whole screen. And then, just as it reached the camera, the screen went black. I sat there, staring at my reflection in the dark monitor, trying to calm myself down. But then, my chat pinged again. Report your findings. I started typing, fingers trembling. I described everything, the parking lot figure, the symbol, the shadowy hospital hallway. But as I typed, I noticed a message pop up beneath Eidolon's name. Very good. The VIP acknowledges your presence. That wasn't part of the instructions. The VIP acknowledges your presence. The words made my skin crawl, and I suddenly remembered that picture I'd seen, that face with too smooth skin, and the unnatural stretched smile. I hadn't seen anything like it during my monitoring, but I had this sinking feeling that whatever was in that picture was watching me now. Then, right as I was about to log off, another message appeared. Do not break routine. You are now the primary connection. I had no idea what that meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a threat, or maybe a warning. I spent the next hour staring blankly at my laptop, waiting for something else to happen, to get some closure. But nothing came, just a quiet, creeping sense that whatever I was dealing with wasn't finished with me yet. As I shut my laptop and crawled into bed, I kept replaying that final line in my head, over and over. You are now the primary connection. I tried to tell myself it was just another part of the prank, but every time I closed my eyes, I could see that smooth, alien face from the profile picture grinning back at me in the dark. And the more I thought about it, the more I had the horrible feeling that whatever that thing was, it hadn't been staring out of a photo. It had been staring back at me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see flashes of that hospital hallway, or that warped face, blurred and wrong. I kept thinking about what Eidolon had said. You are now the primary connection. It was cryptic, sure, but it felt personal, like some invisible line had been drawn between me and whatever this VIP was. The next night came fast. I wanted to quit. Hell, I nearly did. But the money had already hit my account, $5,000, just like Eidolon promised. Seeing that balance made it all feel a little more bearable, like maybe I could handle another night if it meant pocketing that much cash again. All I had to do was follow the routine, log my findings, and keep my mouth shut. So I brewed another pot of coffee, set my alarm, and logged in at exactly 3:33 a.m. The list of sites was the same, but I noticed something strange right away. The first live stream, the parking lot feed, had changed. The angle was different, tilted down as if the camera had been moved. Now I could see a stretch of ground leading up to the spot where the shadow had been standing the night before. It wasn't there tonight, but there was something new on the ground. I squinted, trying to make it out. At first, I thought it was just a pile of trash or something, but as my eyes adjusted to the grainy quality, I realized it was a line of salt, or maybe sand, stretching across the pavement. The line was thick, almost ritualistic, like it was there to keep something out, or maybe in. It didn't move, but I kept watching, trying to understand why it was there. After a few minutes, I moved on to the next site. It was another of those dead forums, only this time the page had more than just blank profiles. A new thread had popped up since the night before, titled in all caps, "Primary connection is now active." My stomach twisted. The post had no content, just a single link at the bottom, which I was supposed to click as part of the routine. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse, but I reminded myself I was being watched. Eidolon was probably tracking every click, and I didn't want to give him any reason to think I wasn't following orders. I clicked. The link led to a black screen with a loading icon in the center, like a video was buffering. It loaded slowly, one frame at a time, showing a dark room that was almost pitch black except for a sliver of light coming in through a doorway at the far end. The room looked familiar, but I couldn't put my finger on why. And then it hit me. It was my living room. The sliver of light was coming from the crack in the curtains. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. There was no one in the frame, but the realization that someone, or something, had recorded my apartment filled me. with this paralyzing sense of dread. I scanned every inch of the video, looking for movement, but there was nothing, just an empty shot of my living room, as if someone had set up a camera and left. My chat pinged again. Continue with the routine. I felt sick, but I clicked to the next site. It was another still image, the hospital corridor again, but this time the picture had changed. The lights were off, and there was no shadow at the end of the hallway. Instead, something small and white was lying on the floor. I squinted at it, leaning closer until I realized it was a folded piece of paper, perfectly centered in the hallway. I clicked on the image, hoping to zoom in, to read what was written on that paper, but the image froze. A notification popped up on my screen, covering everything. Do not investigate further. I felt trapped, like I was balancing on a thin line between following orders and understanding whatever horrible game I'd stumbled into. I could barely breathe as I switched to the final site. The rusted door was there again, with that same red light above it. But tonight, the door was open, just a sliver, like someone or something had pushed it. The darkness inside looked deeper than before, like it could swallow anything that stepped too close. I watched, waiting for the door to swing open wider, for something to step out, but it didn't. It just hung there, slightly ajar, like an invitation I had no intention of accepting. Then, all at once, the door slammed shut. The red light flickered again, but this time, it didn't come back on. The screen stayed dark, and for a long, suffocating minute, I sat there in the black, the quiet hum of my laptop, the only sound in my apartment. I was about to close everything out and send my report when I got another notification. Final task. Prepare for the VIP's arrival. I stared at the message, rereading it over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Arrival? That word hit me like a punch to the gut. Wasn't the whole point of this job to keep the VIP monitored out there, wherever it was? What did it mean by arrival? Then, without thinking, I typed back, arrival. Where? A few seconds passed before Eidolon responded. The VIP will be reaching out directly. Maintain the connection. Do not look away. I sat there frozen, and then, as if on cue, my laptop screen flickered. The picture of the hospital corridor disappeared, replaced by that face, the one from the profile picture. Only now it was moving, its smooth, inhuman face coming closer, filling the screen until its eyes, black and soulless, were all I could see. It was watching me, but it was more than that. I could feel it feeling me, like it wasn't just looking at my image, but peeling back layers, studying every inch of me. My hands were trembling so bad I nearly dropped the laptop, but I couldn't move away. I just sat there, paralyzed, as that thing's mouth stretched into an even wider, more unnatural smile. Then it spoke. Not in words, not exactly. It was more like images, flashes of places I'd never been. A forest at night, lit only by the sliver of a waning moon. A basement with walls scratched raw. A room full of shattered mirrors, each one reflecting that same stretched out smile. I could feel them, see them, all at once, flooding my brain in a way that made me dizzy, sick to my core. Finally, it showed me a last image, a dark, empty room with a single, flickering light bulb swinging from the ceiling, and standing beneath it was me. It was my apartment, no doubt about it. My couch, my TV, even the stack of unopened mail on the coffee table. But I was in the middle of the room, just staring into the camera, grinning like I was posing for some demented family portrait. And then, Just as quickly as it started, the image vanished. I was back to my normal desktop, the chat with Eidolon still open, the message box waiting for me to report findings. My heart was slamming against my ribs. I was drenched in sweat, but I managed to type out a single line. VIP arrival completed. After a long pause, Eidolon responded, "Very good. The connection is complete. Continue as instructed." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that whatever was on the other end of that screen, it was here now, and as I sat there, staring into the blank glow of my laptop, I had the overwhelming, gut-wrenching feeling that I was no longer alone in my apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was in my apartment. After that night, the entire place felt wrong. Every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too far. Every floorboard creaked like someone or something was tiptoeing behind me. My reflection in the windows looked unfamiliar, like I was staring at a version of myself with just enough detail skewed to make me question if it was really me. The next night, I logged on again at 3:33 a.m. like I'd been instructed. At this point, I didn't even care about the money. I just needed answers. I wanted to understand what I was dealing with, and more importantly, how to end it. I was in too deep to just stop. I had this sick feeling that Eidolon wouldn't let me walk away even if I tried. The list of sites was mostly the same, but I noticed something new. A line at the bottom of the document that read, "Tonight, the VIP will test the connection. Follow protocol." The instructions didn't give any more details. No explanations, no hints. Just those cold, clinical words that sent a chill down my spine. My first stop was, once again, the parking lot feed. It looked the same as the night before, that faint line of salt or sand spread across the ground. But now, there was something lying next to the line, a small rectangular object. I squinted, leaning closer to the screen until I realized what it was. My wallet. I shot up from my chair, instinctively patting my pockets. Sure enough, my wallet was gone. It had been on the kitchen counter just hours ago, I was sure of it. But now, there it was, lying in the middle of a grainy parking lot I'd never seen in real life. My ID, my cards, everything. It was all right there on the screen, out of my reach. I felt trapped, like a rat in a maze, knowing full well that someone, something, was watching me scramble. With a shaky hand, I clicked on the next site. This one was a static image of that hospital corridor, the one with the flickering lights. The piece of paper was still on the floor, just a folded square in the middle of the hallway. But this time, it had been unfolded, revealing a single line of handwritten text. I had to zoom in to read it. "Thank you for letting me in." My heart dropped. I hadn't let anyone in. I'd followed every rule, kept to every instruction, done exactly what Eidolon had told me. But as I stared at those words, a sickening realization started to creep in. This entire routine had been a setup. Every click, every site, every instruction had been some twisted way of opening the door, of letting whatever this VIP was get closer, inch by inch, night by night. But I couldn't stop now, not without knowing what I was dealing with. I moved on to the next site. It was the same link to the rusted metal door with the red light above it. The door was shut tight again, but as I watched, the camera feed started to glitch. Static washed over the screen, breaking up the image into distorted pixels, until finally the camera seemed to right itself. And when it did, the door was open again. Only this time, there was something standing in the doorway. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with skin stretched too tight over its frame, just like in the profile picture I'd seen the first night. But in motion, it was so much worse. Its limbs were too long, like the bones had been warped and pulled until they barely held together. And those eyes, black, glossy pits, were locked onto the camera, staring directly at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just watched as it took a step forward, its body jerking unnaturally, like a puppet with its strings tangled. Another step, then another, closer and closer, until it filled the screen, its face inches away, grinning in that horrid, stretched smile. The chat pinged. Do not acknowledge the VIP. Proceed to the final task. I didn't want to. My instincts were screaming at me to shut the laptop, throw it across the room, and never log on again. But something inside me, maybe desperation, maybe fear, forced me to keep going. The final sight was another live stream, this time of what looked like a bedroom. My bedroom. I was staring at my own room, empty and dark, except for the glow of the laptop screen on the desk, exactly where I was sitting. The angle was strange though, like it was shot from somewhere above, as if a camera was tucked into the corner of the ceiling, watching me. I looked up instinctively, but of course, there was nothing there. Then, as I watched the feed, I saw myself. I hadn't moved. I hadn't done anything, but on the screen, my reflection, the me on the screen, stood up from the desk, staring straight into the camera with those same black, soulless eyes. It smiled, slowly, that same twisted, too wide grin, and then it started to walk, one stiff, jerking step at a time, toward the door of my room. I felt paralyzed, watching as my own reflection reached for the doorknob, and then the chat pinged one last time. Complete the connection. Let the VIP in. I heard a knock at my door. My heart nearly stopped. It was soft, barely a sound, but it was there. A gentle rapping that felt both patient and insistent. I sat there, frozen, every muscle locked in terror, unable to tear my eyes from the screen. The me on the live stream turned its head toward the door, its face twisting into that grotesque smile, as if it were waiting for me to get up and open it. And, against all reason, I felt this pull, like a compulsion, something deep and primal, urging me to stand up, to walk over to that door and open it. But I forced myself to stay seated, my hands gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles were white. The knock came again, a little louder this time, a little less patient. Complete the connection. The message flashed on my screen, over and over, filling the chat box until it was the only thing I could see, each new line punctuating the silence in my room. I could feel something standing just beyond the door, waiting, almost humming with anticipation. And as I stared, my resolve started to waver. The pull became stronger, tugging at me, whispering in my mind that all I had to do was open the door and this would all be over. I would be free. My hand drifted toward the doorknob, almost on its own, my fingers shaking as they brushed against the cold metal. I was so close to giving in. But then I remembered those words. Do not acknowledge any entities you see. I tore my hand away, stepping back, forcing myself to break eye contact with the screen. I squeezed my eyes shut, taking deep, ragged breaths, ignoring the faint scratching I could hear now, like nails dragging down the other side of the door. Slowly, painfully, the knocking stopped, the scratching faded, the room fell silent again. I opened my eyes to see my own face staring back at me on the screen, blank and emotionless, just sitting there in the same position I was. The chat was empty, as if none of those messages had ever been sent. And then the last notification popped up. Session complete. The VIP has returned. Expect further instructions. The screen went black, and my laptop powered down. I sat there in the silence, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. But one thing was certain. I wasn't alone in my apartment anymore. And as I lay in bed that night, every creak, every whisper of wind, every soft shuffle in the dark felt like it was coming from just outside my door, waiting for me to open it and complete the connection. For days, I tried to avoid logging back in. I told myself I was done, that I'd ignore Eidolon's messages, forget about the money, about the VIP, and go back to my life. But things didn't go back to normal, not even close. It started with the noises, soft scraping sounds, just outside my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or maybe the wind rattling the doorframe. But then, one night, I heard something that couldn't be explained away. Whispering, faint but unmistakable, like someone was pressing their lips to the door and whispering just loud enough for me to hear the murmur of words I couldn't quite make out. I stayed up all night, waiting for the sounds to stop, but they didn't. Instead, they grew louder, more persistent. By morning, I'd hardly slept. I was a wreck, pacing my apartment, checking every corner, every shadow, feeling like something was watching me no matter where I went. Every time I glanced at a mirror or a dark window, I half expected to see that thing, that reflection of me, with the too wide grin, waiting. Then the messages started. At first I didn't understand how they were getting through. My burner laptop had been shut down, disconnected, and buried in a drawer. But every night at 3:33 a.m., I'd get a notification on my phone, a new message in a chat window that shouldn't have even been there. The first one was simple. Why aren't you completing the connection? I ignored it, silenced my phone, but the messages kept coming. Every night at exactly the same time. It's waiting for you. Let it in. The worst part was that I could feel the thing's presence every time the messages popped up. The air would get heavy, thick with a sense of something standing just out of sight, watching, waiting. The scratching at the door got worse, louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across the wood, getting closer with every passing night. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I'd barricaded myself in my bedroom, shoving my dresser and a chair against the door. But at 3:33 a.m., my phone buzzed again, lighting up with a new message. You can't hide from it. And then the whispering started again. But this time, it was clear. My own voice, muttering things I didn't want to hear. It's cold out here, it said. Let me in, please. I need to come in. Just open the door, and this will all be over. I sat there, back pressed to the wall, hands over my ears, trying to block it out. But the whispering continued, a soft, desperate plea that somehow sounded so much like me. After what felt like hours, the voice finally faded. I let out a shaky breath, thinking I'd made it through another night. Then my phone buzzed again. You have one last chance. That was the final straw. I knew if I didn't do something, this thing would never stop. It had gotten into my life, twisted itself into the fabric of my reality, and somehow I had to sever that connection. I spent the next day looking into everything I could about the dark web, tracking IPs, shutting down access points, anything to sever the line that had been created between me and it. But no matter what I tried, nothing worked. Every night, the messages still came, and the scratching grew louder. Finally, desperate, I logged back onto the burner laptop. The screen flickered on, and before I could even open the chat, a message from Eidolon appeared. "The VIP is waiting." I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to ask what exactly I'd let into my life, but I knew it wouldn't get me anywhere. So with shaking hands, I typed back, "What does it want?" There was a pause. Then the message appeared. "It wants what you took." I stared at the words, my mind racing. What I took? I hadn't taken anything. I'd followed the instructions, monitored the sites, kept my distance. I hadn't touched or interacted with any of it, except for that one time, when I'd seen the folded paper in the hospital corridor and zoomed in to read it. "Thank you for letting me in." That's what it had said, and with a gut-wrenching realization, I understood. By looking, by acknowledging that message, I'd broken the most important rule. Do not acknowledge any entities you see. In my desperation to understand, I'd invited it in, opened a door that couldn't be closed. I typed a final message to Eidolon. "How do I undo it?" Another pause. Then, complete the connection. Fulfill the VIP's purpose. My hands were trembling as I typed back. "What purpose?" But there was no answer. Instead, the chat window closed, and the screen went black. And then, I heard it, the knock on my front door. I don't know how I managed to stand. Every part of me was screaming to run, to hide, to get out of that apartment and never look back. But I knew it would only follow. Whatever I'd invited in, it was part of me now, and it wasn't leaving without taking something in return. The knock came again, louder this time. Heart pounding, I made my way to the door. I stopped just in front of it, my hand hovering over the doorknob, feeling the icy chill seeping through the wood. And that's when I heard my own voice again, muffled but clear, coming from the other side. "Let me in," it whispered. "It's cold out here." My hand trembled as I gripped the doorknob. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew this was exactly what it wanted. But the pull, that horrible, irresistible compulsion, was stronger than ever. With a shaky breath, I turned the knob and pulled the door open. There was nothing there, just darkness, stretching out before me like a void. But as I stared into it, I saw movement, shadows shifting and twisting, and then a figure. It was me, standing just a few feet away, staring back at me with that same stretched grin, the same black eyes, cold and empty. It reached out a hand, beckoning me forward, inviting me to step into that darkness. And then, for the first time, it spoke aloud. "Thank you," it said, in my own voice, layered with something darker, older, and filled with a deep, endless hunger. "You've made the connection complete." The last thing I remember was the sensation of being pulled forward into that darkness, my own face grinning back at me, watching as I disappeared into the void. And now, I'm here. I don't know where this place is, but it's cold and empty and filled with the echo of that same horrible whisper. I can feel myself slipping, losing who I was bit by bit, as if my own identity is fading into the shadows around me. But every night at 3:33 a.m., I reach out. I knock on the door, hoping someone will hear me, will let me in. And I wait, trapped in the dark, hoping that whoever opens the door next doesn't make the same mistake I did. I found an invite to a Halloween ritual on the dark web. Now they're telling me I can't leave. Alright, Reddit. I don't usually post on here, but this was too messed up not to share. To give you some context, I'm a pretty curious guy, and I've been down internet rabbit holes that most people would avoid. I know the deep web and dark web can be sketchy, but I've never had anything scary happen. I think I got too comfortable. I got cocky, maybe, and that's probably why I clicked on something I shouldn't have. It started a few nights ago when I was scrolling through this deep web marketplace. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just liked browsing. If you're familiar with the dark web, you know what I mean. It's like exploring a different world, even if that world is kind of, well, scummy. Anyway, I was just about to close everything down when a pop-up appeared out of nowhere, which was weird because pop-ups are pretty rare there. It wasn't selling anything though. It was an invitation, just a plain black background with this eerie text. You're invited to join us this Halloween. Join our ritual. See the truth. Only the curious will find us. Below it, there was a link, and the text was flashing. Flashing in a really unnatural way, like someone designed it to catch you off guard. Now, I'm the kind of guy who sees a door labeled "Do Not Enter" and thinks, well, I'm entering. So, naturally, I clicked on it. The link led me to a page that was almost too simple to be believable. All it said was, October 31st, midnight. Follow the instructions exactly. Below that were instructions to download a PDF, which I did. It wasn't a huge file, and I almost backed out right there, thinking it was probably some virus. But curiosity got the better of me, so I downloaded it. Now, here's where it started to feel wrong. The file opened up into a document that looked like a normal invite on the surface. Some corny font, black and orange colors, and an outline of a pentagram in the background. But the details were where it got weird. It listed coordinates to this place, about 2 hours away from my town. Not a specific address, just coordinates. I checked it on Google Maps, and it led to the middle of nowhere. No roads, no buildings, nothing but dense woods. Be there by 11:50 p.m. Alone, it said, in all caps, and then it had this part that read, wear a mask that hides your face. Do not bring a phone or any electronics. I remember thinking, yeah, that sounds about right for a creepy ritual. But there was this part at the end of the invite that really stuck with me. Once you have joined, you cannot leave. Curiosity binds you. Your journey does not end here. If this was supposed to scare me off, it was doing a decent job. But, I don't know, I just felt pulled to it. Like, yeah, the whole thing sounded like some weird prank. But what if it wasn't? What if this was one of those underground societies, or some bizarre Halloween cult? And let's be real, if it's happening at Halloween and on the deep web, it's gotta be worth checking out. But this isn't the part that gets crazy. I didn't go there that night. Yet. First, I decided to do some digging. I posted anonymously in a deep web forum describing the invitation without giving away too much. I just wanted to see if anyone else had gotten the same message or if it was a known scam. A few people replied with comments like, classic deep web scare tactics, and don't be an idiot and show up to a random spot in the woods. But then I got a private message. The user's name was random gibberish, and the message was short, like they were typing it in a rush. Don't go. They don't play games. Once you're in for life. There's no leaving, no backing out. I remember reading it over a few times, and I felt this cold, prickling sensation in the back of my neck. This wasn't your typical anonymous warning. It felt like someone actually knew something. But here's the thing. I couldn't find anything else about it online. No mention of rituals in the woods. No details on what this Halloween thing might be. Nothing. Just that one message. I went back to the page with the invitation, and I swear I had closed it, but it was still there, just waiting on my screen. I stared at it, and something inside me just clicked. I mean, this was the kind of thing people don't come across every day. It was probably a one-time chance, and I wanted to see what it was. Maybe I was just being reckless, but part of me wanted to prove that I wasn't scared. So, I told myself, fine, I'll go to the spot. I'll check it out, see what's up, and if it looks sketchy, I'll bail. Simple plan, right? But nothing about this was actually simple. And looking back, I should have trusted that gut feeling when I first read the message. I spent the next few days trying to keep myself busy, but all I could think about was that ritual, those coordinates. Halloween was coming up fast, and I hadn't told anyone about my plan. Honestly, it felt like a bad idea to tell people. Like, what was I supposed to say? Hey, I found an invite to a ritual on the dark web, and I'm thinking of going. By the time October 31st rolled around, I was feeling a weird mix of excitement and dread. I followed the instructions, dressed in dark clothes, wore an old mask I found in a Halloween store a couple of years ago. I left my phone at home, like the invite said. I know that was stupid, but I was really trying to play by the rules. It was almost like I felt I had to. I left the house around 9:30 p.m., and as I drove out of town, that uneasy feeling just kept building. The road got emptier and darker, and by the time I reached the woods, there was no one around. No streetlights, no sounds except for the wind and my own breathing. I parked my car a little ways off from the coordinates and walked the last half mile. Just me, my flashlight, and the echo of my footsteps. When I got close, I started to hear voices, murmurs, soft like chanting. I felt a chill run through me, but I kept walking, pushing past the branches until I saw a clearing ahead. There was a dim glow, and I realized they'd lit a circle of candles. Figures were standing around, all wearing these identical black cloaks and masks. The masks were plain, blank faces, completely expressionless. My heart was pounding, but I was in too deep to turn back. As I stepped closer, one of them turned to me, and it felt like their gaze cut right through my mask, like they could see my face underneath. They didn't say anything. They just beckoned me into the circle. I should have turned and run, but I didn't. And if I'd known what was about to happen next, I might have. But by that point, I was hooked. Curiosity had me, just like they wanted. I stepped into the circle, and immediately, the air felt different, heavy, almost buzzing with this weird static. I could smell burning wax from the candles, but there was something else underneath, a metallic scent, faint but unsettling. The figures, all of them cloaked and masked, shifted slightly, closing the circle tighter as if to trap me in. My pulse was thudding in my ears, but I tried to keep my breathing steady. They hadn't said a word to me, not one. I was waiting for someone to give me instructions, tell me what this whole thing was about, but they just stood there, silent and still. I felt like I was on display, like they were sizing me up. Finally, the figure directly across from me took a step forward. This one was taller, with an odd symbol painted on their mask, a simple black X over where the eyes would be. The figure held out something small and dark in their hand. It took me a second to realize it was a piece of paper, folded and sealed with red wax. They didn't say anything, just handed it to me. I looked around, half expecting someone to laugh or say, "Gotcha!" But nothing. All I could hear was the low murmur of the chanting that was still going, coming from everyone around me. I cracked the wax seal and unfolded the paper. Scrawled in handwriting that was almost too small to read were a set of instructions. Simple, but creepy as hell. Walk to the center of the circle. Stand perfectly still. Close your eyes and keep them shut. Do not open them until you are told. This was the part where my nerves started to feel like they were on fire. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn and leave. But I'd come this far, and I didn't want to be the one who chickened out. Besides, the chanting was building now, getting louder, and the thought of breaking the silence or turning my back on them seemed wrong somehow, like it would set something in motion that I didn't want to find out about. I stepped to the center of the circle, feeling the eyes, or at least the presence, of every person in that group on me. I could feel the heat of the candles around the edge of the circle, smell the burning wax mixed with that metallic scent again. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. The chanting grew louder, almost deafening, and I was certain it wasn't in English. The words twisted in the air, guttural and ancient, like they were scraping against my brain. My knees started to shake, but I forced myself to stay still, to follow their instructions. I kept my eyes shut, even when I heard footsteps approaching me from different directions. Whoever they were close. I could feel their breath against my skin. Someone whispered something, one harsh, grating word I couldn't understand, and I could feel the prickle of their voice on my neck, and then everything went dead silent. Not quiet, but that eerie kind of silence that makes you feel like you're floating in a vacuum. No wind, no footsteps, nothing. It felt like the world had just stopped. I thought maybe I'd gone deaf until I felt a hand grab my shoulder. Hard, cold fingers like they'd been dipped in ice. I almost flinched, but I forced myself to stay still. Then I heard a voice, a low whisper, but somehow clear as a bell. "You have been chosen." I didn't know what that meant, and I sure as hell didn't like the way it sounded. Chosen for what? Before I could even process it, I felt another hand press something against my chest, heavy and cold. It felt like metal, and the way they pushed it against me almost hurt. I couldn't see it, obviously, but I could feel the edges of it digging into my skin through my shirt. "Keep it," the voice said, still in that eerie whisper. "It's yours now." My mind was racing, trying to figure out what it even was, but they kept pressing it against me until I clutched it in my hand, the metal shockingly cold and jagged. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened my eyes just a crack, and I almost screamed. The figures weren't wearing the masks anymore. They were still standing there, but their faces were wrong. Twisted, almost like they'd been stretched and melted. Their eyes were huge, black pits, and their mouths hung open in twisted smiles that looked too wide to be human. And the one standing in front of me, the one with the X symbol, was staring right at me with a face I'd only seen in nightmares. I couldn't tell you what they actually looked like, because my mind was doing everything it could to erase the memory the moment I saw it. But that face, it was like it was trying to crawl into my brain and stay there. I stumbled back, clutching the object they'd forced on me, a small, oddly shaped metal amulet, rough and jagged. It was shaped like a distorted pentagram, with edges that didn't quite match up, like it had been warped. My first thought was to throw it on the ground and run, but that wasn't even an option. As soon as I tried to pull my hand away, My fingers wouldn't let go. I couldn't drop it. It was like it was glued to my skin. The chanting started again, softer this time, and the figures just faded. I'm not saying they turned around or walked away. They just disappeared, like fog rolling back. One moment they were there, staring at me with those hollow eyes and twisted smiles, and then nothing. Just the woods, the dim glow of the candles, and silence. I finally managed to pry my fingers off the amulet, shoving it into my pocket, like I could forget it was there. My heart was racing, and I was out of breath even though I hadn't moved an inch. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I needed to get out of there, fast. But as I turned to head back to my car, I realized I wasn't alone. There was someone else standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. No mask, no cloak, just a figure standing there, watching me. I couldn't make out their face, but something about the way they stood, the way their head was slightly tilted, made my skin crawl. I took a step back, and the figure mirrored me, stepping forward in perfect sync. I took another step, and so did they. It was like they were a shadow, following my every move. I tried to walk faster, but no matter how fast I moved, they stayed right there, always just a few steps behind, just close enough that I could feel their presence. I broke into a sprint, my heart pounding, the amulet clanging against my leg as I ran. I could hear the footsteps behind me, matching my pace. I didn't dare look back, not even when I reached my car and threw myself into the driver's seat. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, I managed to start the car, and I peeled out of there, watching the trees in my rearview mirror. The figure was still standing there at the edge of the clearing, just watching me leave. I felt its gaze burn into the back of my skull the entire drive home. But here's the thing. I should have felt relieved when I finally got away, but I didn't. Not even close. That silence from the woods, the chanting, it followed me, like an echo in my mind. And the amulet? Yeah, that thing wasn't just a souvenir. I still had it in my pocket, and every time I touched it, I felt that same chilling sensation, like it was feeding off of me somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a piece of them. The first night back home, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see their faces, stretched, hollow, with those empty black pits where eyes should have been. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was just a twisted Halloween prank, I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd seen me, like they'd looked through the mask, straight into me, and found something they wanted. That weird, warped amulet sat on my nightstand. I'd thought about throwing it out the window, burying it in the backyard, or just leaving it at some random place far away from me. But whenever I went to pick it up, I'd freeze. I knew I couldn't just get rid of it. Somehow, I knew they'd come back for me if I tried. The next day, I decided to go online and see if I could find anything about these rituals or that symbol on the mask. I wasn't expecting much. After all, the deep web is a black hole of hidden information, and even when you do find something, it's not exactly user-friendly. But this wasn't something I could shake off, so I went down every rabbit hole I could find. At first, all I found were conspiracy theories and cult forums. Most of it was standard weird stuff. Old folklore, superstitions, and secret societies that probably didn't exist. But then I found a thread buried in a forum for occult practices. It was just one post, written years ago, by a user who hadn't been active since. If you ever come across an invite to the Halloween ritual, don't go. Once they see you, you're marked. They call themselves the Eyes, but they're far more than that. They don't play by human rules. They're everywhere and nowhere, watching. The amulet is their mark, a way to keep you. If you get one, it's already too late. All you can do is hope they lose interest. But they rarely do. The replies were filled with people calling the poster a lunatic, a troll, but my gut was telling me this was real. I read the post over and over, picking apart every word, feeling more and more nauseous. Marked. That word stuck with me, twisting in my stomach like a knife. If they were right, there was no escaping this. The days went on, and weird things started happening. At first, it was little stuff, things I could brush off as coincidence. I'd feel like someone was watching me through the windows, even though I'd checked 100 times to make sure they were locked. Random items around my house would be slightly out of place. Not enough to scream break-in, but enough to make me question my own memory. The amulet seemed to move on its own, too. I'd put it on my nightstand, and in the morning, it'd be halfway across the room. I'd try convincing myself I'd just moved it without remembering, but it didn't feel right. Then, about a week after the ritual, I started noticing people in masks. At first, it was just one or two, and I told myself it was just leftover Halloween costumes. But the masks were wrong. They weren't cheap rubber or plastic. These were the same blank, expressionless masks I'd seen in the woods, and they were always in my peripheral vision, gone the moment I turned my head to look. One night, I was walking back from the store when I saw someone in one of those cloaks standing under a streetlight a few blocks from my house. I stopped in my tracks, and they didn't move. They were just watching me. I forced myself to look away, telling myself I was seeing things, but when I looked back, they were gone. I didn't sleep that night. Then the notes started showing up. The first one was slipped under my front door, a small torn piece of paper with just one sentence. "You are bound to us." I stared at it, feeling that same prickle of dread I'd felt in the woods. The handwriting was the same as the invitation, and I knew they'd been in my house. I locked every door and window, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. They could get to me whenever they wanted. 2 days later, I found another note on my pillow. "Curiosity is a chain, and you have bound yourself." I tore it up, but the words were burned into my mind. I didn't know what they wanted from me, but they clearly weren't letting go. At this point, I wasn't leaving the house unless I absolutely had to. I was starting to look paranoid, pale, exhausted, jumping at every little sound. My friends noticed. They'd ask me what was going on, but I didn't have the words to explain. How do you tell someone you're being haunted by something you can't even name? One evening, just as the sun was setting, I got another message. This time, it was a notification on my phone, even though I deleted all my deep web apps. The notification blinked with that same ominous text. "We see you." When I clicked it, the screen went black. I waited, heart pounding, and then the camera on my phone opened up by itself. For a second, it just showed my own face, looking horrified and sweaty in the dim light of my room. And then, slowly, a figure moved into the frame, right behind me. It was one of them, wearing the mask with the X on it, and it was so close I could see the blank, white surface of the mask just inches from the back of my head. I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone in the room. But when I turned back to my phone, the camera was still open, and now the figure was right up to the lens, filling the entire screen. I dropped the phone, and when I picked it back up, the camera was normal again, just showing my own panicked face. I barely slept after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was back in that clearing, surrounded by the silent, masked figures, trapped in that circle. And every night, the noises around my house grew worse. Footsteps in the hallway, shadows slipping past my window, whispers echoing from the walls. I was living in constant fear, waiting for something, anything, to give me a sign of what they wanted from me. And then last night, I heard a knock on my front door around midnight. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, the kind that make your skin crawl. I sat frozen, staring at the door, hoping it would just go away. But after a minute, the knocks came again, louder this time. I forced myself to stand up, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I felt like a puppet, like I wasn't even in control of my own movements. I unlocked the door, barely cracking it open. I expected to see a figure in a cloak, one of those blank masks staring back at me. But the porch was empty. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking maybe it was some trick, until I noticed something on the ground just outside my door. It was a small box, wrapped in black paper and tied with a thin, red string. With trembling hands, I picked it up and brought it inside. Part of me didn't want to open it, but I knew I had to. Whatever was happening, I needed to know. Inside the box was another note, but this time, there was something else. A small, old-fashioned pocket watch, tarnished with age. I stared at it, feeling the weight of it in my palm, and then I read the note. Midnight approaches. Be ready. Your curiosity has brought you this far. Now you will see the truth. The second I finished reading, the watch started ticking, louder than any watch I'd ever heard. I tried to stop it, to cover it, but the ticking just grew louder, echoing in my ears until I couldn't think straight. And that's when I realized the countdown had started. Midnight was coming, and so were they. The ticking of the pocket watch didn't stop. If anything, it was getting louder, like it was vibrating against my palm, matching my racing heartbeat. I stared at it, watching the second hand sweep around, each tick pressing down on me, squeezing tighter with every beat. Midnight was only a few hours away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just time passing. It was something counting down, something far beyond my control. I knew I needed answers. I couldn't wait around for whatever was coming at midnight, so I did the only thing I could think of. I went back to the dark web, hoping I could find something, anything, that would tell me what they wanted. I knew it was a long shot, but there had to be others who'd been through this, right? I wasn't the first person to follow that invitation. I couldn't be. I typed every keyword I could think of, scanning through old forums, encrypted messages, and hidden threads. Most of it was junk, nothing that even remotely fit. But just when I was about to give up, I found a message board I hadn't seen before. It was called The Watcher's Haven, and it seemed to be full of stories from people who'd encountered strange symbols, rituals, and underground cults. I'd scrolled past it in the past, thinking it was all fake. Now, I was desperate enough to believe anything. One post caught my eye. The title was, "To those marked by the eyes, there's no escape." The person described almost exactly what I'd experienced. The invitation, the ritual, the amulet. The post was years old, but it sounded like it was written yesterday. My heart was racing as I read the details. every word digging into me like ice. If you're reading this, then it's too late for you too. They don't just want to scare you, they want you as part of them. It's not just a ritual, it's a binding. The amulet you received, it's like an anchor, something that tethers you to their world. Destroying it doesn't help. It's a reminder. You carry it because it connects you to them, even when they're not around. The more I read, the colder I felt. The poster talked about the midnight visits, how the eyes would appear at random, watching until the chosen couldn't take it anymore. He claimed they'd reach a point of no return, that once midnight struck, their souls, or whatever made them, was no longer theirs. At the end of the post, in jagged, almost desperate writing, he'd scrawled one final line. If the watch starts ticking, you're in their countdown. Midnight isn't the end. Midnight is the beginning. I felt like the walls were closing in. The ticking watch in my hand grew louder, the sound filling my entire house. I tried to convince myself that this was just a story, just some twisted online fiction, but I knew better. This was real. Whatever was happening to me wasn't just a trick or a scare tactic. It was a trap. I was part of something far bigger, something that had been pulling people in for years. I heard the floor creak behind me, and I froze. I knew I was alone in the house, but that creak was too deliberate, too heavy to be anything else. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see one of the figures standing there, blank face staring me down, but the room was empty. Only, it didn't feel empty. There was a weight in the air, a presence, like someone was just beyond my vision, waiting for me to look away so they could move closer. I felt my hands tremble, and I realized I was still clutching the pocket watch. Its ticking was relentless, drilling into my brain. Midnight was getting closer, and I knew I was running out of time. I don't know what drove me to do it, but I bolted out of my house and drove to the only place I could think of, the clearing. I didn't have a plan, didn't know what I'd do once I got there, but I felt like I had to confront them. Like if I didn't, they'd pull me into whatever darkness they came from the moment midnight struck. The drive felt longer than it should have, and every shadow on the side of the road looked like it was watching me, following me. My headlights barely cut through the dark, and the ticking watch felt like a heartbeat, pulsing with every mile. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, I was drenched in cold sweat, the watch still clutched in my hand. I parked at the edge of the clearing and stepped out of the car, and the silence hit me like a wave. No crickets, no wind, just that oppressive stillness, like the whole forest was holding its breath. And then I saw them. The figures were standing in the clearing, exactly where they'd been that night. The candles were lit again, flickering in a perfect circle around them, but now the flames were low, almost as if they were struggling to stay lit. They were all facing me, those blank faces staring, waiting. The figure with the X on the mask stepped forward, raising a hand to beckon me into the circle. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. It was like something inside me was pulling me toward them, like the amulet was guiding me forward. I don't know what I expected to happen when I crossed into the circle, but as soon as I did, the world seemed to shift. Everything outside the circle faded, like I was in a vacuum. The ticking of the watch stopped, and that silence returned, heavier than before. The figure with the X mask raised their hands, and in a voice that was barely a whisper but echoed through my skull, they said, "You are one of us now." And then, one by one, they began to remove their masks. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in that suffocating silence, forced to watch as their faces were revealed. Except they didn't have faces. Where their features should have been, there was only darkness, shifting like smoke, twisting into shapes that were almost human, but always just wrong. I felt a scream clawing at my throat, but it was trapped, lost in the void around me. "You wear our mark," the figure said, gesturing to the amulet. "It binds you to us. You will watch as we watch, see as we see." Before I could process the words, the others raised their arms, pointing at me, and suddenly the forest was gone. I was falling, spiraling into a void, and the only sound was the ticking of the watch, now deafening, echoing all around me. And in that moment, I felt it, their eyes on me, watching from every direction, from beyond the void, from within the darkness. I blinked, and I was back in my room, alone, the pocket watch lying open in my hand, its second hand frozen at midnight. But I knew deep down that I wasn't alone, not anymore. I looked up, and there, reflected in the darkened window, I saw them, the blank faces, the hollow eyes, all staring back at me, from behind my own reflection. And I understood. I was part of them now, bound by curiosity, tied to their watching. Midnight was only the beginning. It's been 3 days since that night. I haven't been outside since. Haven't even opened the blinds. But it doesn't matter. They're still watching. I can feel them everywhere, like shadows clinging to every corner of my vision, waiting for me to slip. Every time I close my eyes, even for a second, I see them, blank faces stretching into twisted smiles, empty eyes pulling me deeper. I thought they might leave once I joined them, but they're not going anywhere. If anything, they're getting closer. That first night back, I barely slept. Every creak, every shift in the darkness felt like a warning. I stayed in bed, eyes wide open, staring into the pitch black, too afraid to move, to even breathe. It felt like they were right there in the room, just beyond my sight, waiting for me to acknowledge them. And when I finally did drift off, it wasn't sleep. It was like falling into their world, sliding into the dark. The dreams, they weren't dreams. I'd find myself back in the clearing, standing in the circle of candles, the cold earth beneath my feet, the smell of burning wax thick in the air. The cloaked figures would be there, surrounding me, whispering words in that ancient, guttural language. I'd be frozen, unable to move or scream, and their eyes, those empty black pits, would stare into me, searching, like they were pulling something out of me, something I couldn't get back. The amulet was still on my nightstand, twisted and warped, like it was rotting in a way that metal shouldn't rot. I tried moving it to a drawer, hiding it in the closet, even throwing it in the trash, but every time I looked, it was back on the nightstand, like it was attached to me, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. The ticking watch had gone silent, but I could still hear it in my mind, that countdown, warning me that I was already running out of time. On the second night, I started hearing whispers. It started quietly, almost like the hum of electricity, something you can ignore if you don't pay too much attention. But as the night went on, the whispers grew louder, layering over each other, voices that seemed to slip in and out of my head. They weren't speaking English, but I knew what they were saying. They were reminding me that I belonged to them now, that there was no escape. I didn't even need to understand the words to feel the weight of them pressing down on me. I tried playing music, turning on every light in the house, but nothing helped. The whispers were inside me, coming from somewhere I couldn't shut out, At some point, I just sat on the floor, covering my ears, rocking back and forth like a kid, whispering, "This isn't real. This isn't real," over and over again. But deep down, I knew it was pointless. They were real. They were here. When dawn finally came, the voices stopped, but the silence was worse. It was that same suffocating quiet from the circle, like the world was holding its breath, watching, waiting. I didn't dare open the blinds or look outside. I had this gut feeling that if I looked, I'd see them standing there, waiting for me to acknowledge them, to invite them in completely. Last night was the worst. Just after midnight, the knocking started. Slow, steady, deliberate. 3 knocks at my front door, just like the first night. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, hoping it was just some late-night prank or my imagination. But then the knocks came again, louder this time, more insistent, like they were daring me to open the door. I didn't move. I didn't even blink, just stared at the door, feeling that same icy dread crawl up my spine. But the knocking didn't stop. It came again and again, faster, until it was pounding, rattling the door, shaking the whole house. I thought it would break the door down. I thought they'd just come in and take me, drag me into whatever darkness they came from. Then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. I stayed frozen, waiting for something to happen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I tried to convince myself it was over, that maybe they'd moved on, but then I heard it, a soft scratching sound, like nails against wood, coming from my bedroom window. I didn't want to look. I knew it was a bad idea, but it was like some twisted instinct took over, like they were pulling me toward the window. Slowly, I turned, barely daring to breathe, and there, just outside the glass, was a face. It was one of them. The X marked across its mask, head tilted, staring at me with those empty pits where eyes should have been. It wasn't moving, just watching, and then, without a sound, it raised a hand, pressing its fingers against the glass. Its head tilted further, its mouth stretching into a smile far too wide, far too unnatural. I wanted to scream, to look away, but my body wouldn't listen. I was paralyzed, locked in place by its gaze. Then, slowly, its finger traced something onto the fogged glass of the window. A single word. Forever. The meaning was clear, final. There was no running, no escaping. I belonged to them, just like the others who had been marked before me. The figure stayed there, silent, its face so close to mine that I could almost feel its breath, cold and stale, pressing against the glass. And then, slowly, it faded, like smoke in the wind, leaving only that word on the window, staring back at me, a reminder that this was my life now. This morning, I packed a bag. I don't know where I'm going, but I can't stay here. The whispers are still in my head, growing louder every time the sun sets, and the shadows feel thicker, closer, like they're waiting for the night to pull me under completely. I don't know if leaving will help. I don't even know if I can escape them, but I have to try. I don't know who will read this, if anyone, but if you do, don't follow the invitation. Don't let curiosity drag you in, because once you've been marked, there's no going back, no safety, no peace, just the endless watching, the whispers, and the knowledge that midnight never really ends. It's with you forever, and someday, maybe years from now, you'll hear that knocking, that slow, steady tapping, reminding you that they're still there, still waiting, and when you answer, they'll finally take you.